And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Jennifer Roback Morse. Her book is The Sexual State, How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along, published by TAN, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. It's great to see you again, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Doug.
And people remember seeing you on with Father Mitch back in the spring on,
Yes.
On the show, talking about this book, The Sexual State. It's interesting, so much of the world we hear about today talking about elites. Who are these elites that you're talking about?
Well, there are two kinds of elites that you could talk about. You know, you could talk about the billionaires like George Soros and Bill Gates and those kind of people. And those people actually have a very outsized influence in our sexual culture, and that's one of the things I talk about in the book. But the other way you can look at it is to look at the college-educated professional class, and I call that the managerial class. And that group of people has an important role to play in building up and maintaining the sexual state. And I end the book with an appeal to those people to say, you know what, you don't have to keep doing this. You know, you have a role to play to correct the situation. And so that's how I end the book, on that particular helpful note.
Now, you say why the church was right all along. Now, obviously, this is EWTN. We certainly believe that. But there's a lot of people out there going and saying, you're talking about the sexual state. I thought you might have been talking about the Catholic Church with the way things are going on right now.
Yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate subtitle at this particular moment in history.
Right.
You know, but on second thought, no one in their right mind, here or at this network or anyplace else, would ever say that everyone in the church has always done the right thing at all times. That's not what we mean to say. What we mean to say is that the teachings are correct, the doctrine is correct. And in fact, I was in front of a religiously mixed audience not long ago, and I said, you know, look, this was at one time the common teaching of all Christian churches, and today the most reliable place to find that is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in spite of what you might hear from other, you know, priests who aren't telling the whole story, or bishops who are off the rails, or whatever it is. You know, the most reliable place to find the ancient Christian teaching that's our common heritage of everyone is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And so that's what I mean to say, and to call attention to the fact that that's a coherent body of doctrine that makes internal sense and that is good and humane and life-giving, and that's what the book's really all about.
Now, you're into data, and one of the things I noted that you put a note on the timeliness of data. You say those old and obsolete studies show that we knew from the beginning that something was not going according to the ideological plan. We had reason to know that people were suffering. We ignored that evidence. You say, if my hypothesis is correct, the age of these studies will not be a problem. The events that transpired between the time of this writing and the time you read the book should confirm my proposition. The sexual revolution has been a big mistake. Is that some of what sometimes gets charged? Is it you're just using old statistics and numbers and they're not relevant anymore?
Well,
is that why you put that in there?
You know, yes, that is absolutely why I put it in there. And I try to stay up to date, but you can't stay up to date on every single topic, number one. And number two, as soon as you put something into a book, it's out of date if you look at it from that perspective. But the distinction that I'm making there, Doug, is that if you're talking about human nature, studies are never out of date, right? So if you've got a study that says kids need their parents, that's not going to go out of date. You know, if you've got a study that says women are upset by their abortions, that has to do with something very deep inside the human person. You're not going to wipe that out with something, you know, you're not going to explain that away 10 years later. And underneath this, underneath the whole of the sexual revolution is the idea that we have to somehow remake human nature, right? The sexual revolution really is a war against nature and a big complaint against nature, you know? And so if your view of the good world and the good society and the ideal universe, if that requires human nature to change, I'm telling you, you are the one who is doing something inhuman here, you know, not the people who are defending human nature.
Right. It's interesting because obviously we live in a world where a progressive attitude sees almost a Darwinist, well, we're evolving, we're creating, we're getting better all the time. So the reality is we can't really learn a lot from the past.
Right. Everybody's starting de novo, you know, and what happened before doesn't really matter. But you see, built into that narrative that you just described is the presumption that we're progressing. I think we're descending into barbarism. Right, and you have to make the case that it is progressive, that it's good, that it's humane, and by framing it from the beginning that this is progress.
Right.
You never have to actually make the case. And so I'm just kind of waving a flag here for readers and for, for people watching a program like this to be aware when somebody brings out that word progress or progressive, that's your red flag, that's your alarm bell to say, there may be something here they can't actually defend, and that they're trying to paste a nice label on so that they don't have to.
They're certainly not talking about the Pilgrim's Progress at this point.
No, no.
That's not exactly what they're focused on.
No.
Well, it's a very optimistic book. You start off in chapter 1, The Misery of Modern Life.
Right.
The greatest disease in the West today is not TB or leprosy, though it seems like we're catching up maybe with some of that. It is being unwanted, unloved, and cared for, and that's what St. Teresa of Calcutta said in A Simple Path. You say, this book is about the ideology of the sexual revolution the havoc has created in the lives of its victims. Once you see the connection between these things, you'll never be the same. When did you see the connection?
Boy, that's a good question. It took a while to put all the pieces together, Doug, I must say. I first started to see the connection when we, back in 1991, when we adopted a little boy from a Romanian orphanage who was two and a half years old when we got him, and then 6 months later we gave birth to a little girl. So 2 kids arrived within 6 months of each other, but 3 years apart in chronological age. Seeing what those two went through and how they developed and how easy it was for our daughter and how difficult it was for our son, it's like, bam, that was the big light bulb. Kids need their parents. Kids really need, we are doing a lot for our kids that we don't even realize, just sort of the ordinary things that parents take for granted. You're doing an enormous amount for them. And so that was the beginning. And that was the beginning of the end of me being a career woman. That was the beginning of the end of me being attached to these ideas that sexual liberation was somehow beneficial. And over time, it's taken a while, but I feel like in the last couple of years, I would say starting around 2013, the pieces really kind of all fit together, because I've been in a number of battles. I was very involved in the gay marriage debate and so on, and which I allude to from time to time, in the book, but it's not really about gay marriage. Right. This book isn't about gay marriage.
Right, it's not.
So somewhere in there, I gave a lot of talks to small audiences. So I could look out there and I could see, like 50 or 100 people, and I could see what they were reacting to. And I could say, they're not getting this. Right. And so over time I came to see that in order to believe gay marriage is a good thing, you have to have already believed certain things. And I started spelling out those things, and that's how I came up with these 3 ideologies. You have to already believe that sex is essentially a sterile act. Mentally, you have to sterilize the sexual act. Okay. Secondly,
it's just like an animal act, basically.
It's recreational. It has no social significance.
Right, and there's no emotion attached to it.
There need not be. It's just
at least
fun.
long term.
Just fun. Just fun. Babies bonding. Not particularly. All secondary. So that was the genesis of the thing I call the contraceptive ideology in this book. The second thing that people have to already believe is they have to believe that kids don't really need their parents very much. So that if a same-sex couple uses third-party reproduction and buys a sperm or buys an egg and reproduces in that manner, the kid will be fine with that, no problem at all. I'm going, that's not. I know that. I've talked to enough donor-conceived persons that I know that that's not true, And then you can connect that with the experience of children of divorce, and you go, whoa, we already accepted the idea that you could switch out parents for whatever reason you want. We already accepted that in our culture.
Or at least the idea was that though that might not be optimum, it was better than having a child live in a family with upsetment and abuse.
That's right. Upset. If the parents are happy, the kids will be happy. But as you communicate with people who've actually been through this, the undeniable message that the parents are sending to the child, whether they don't intend to be doing this, but the message that the child receives is, my new life with a new partner is more significant to me than you, and it's certainly more significant to me than your other parent, right? And which is, of course, if you buy sperm, you're saying that other parent's completely out of the picture,
Right.
permanently out of the picture. So, you start to see, well, there's very deep commonality with these ideas, and we've already accepted the idea that kids are fine,
Right.
so we don't have to worry about that. And then finally, the society has already accepted the idea that the differences between men and women are not particularly significant,
Right.
and they're socially constructed, they can be reconstructed. It's not really a big deal. So if we remove the gender requirement from marriage, nothing bad's going to happen. 2 men, 2 women, 1 of each, whatever.
Why just one of each?
Why just one, So I do remember, it was a speech where I was, kind of repackaging and trying to explain this body of ideas. I do remember the first time that I saw that, I was talking to the people at the Alliance Defending Freedom, and I remember thinking, the whole society has already accepted these 3 ideas. They're all false, but the society has accepted them, and they can't figure out why we're holding out about gay marriage, because to them it's like, well, what's the big deal if 2 guys get married? Because everything significant has already been removed from their minds.
Well, it's almost on a different level, like the term diversity is always good.
Right.
The accepted thing is you have to believe that, and everybody already believes that, but
Right.
yet the proof of that is wanting in many cases.
That's right. That's right.
Now you say the ideology, to say it, separate sex from childbearing, as you said, separate both sex and childbearing from marriage, and ultimately eliminate all distinctions between men and women. And one of the things that struck me in the stories that you put together, you have some individuals, some are amalgams of people, and some
Right.
are individuals. This one struck me because of having grown up in the 60s and the 70s and seeing women be told, that basically, having children was not going to be a problem, the idea. And she said, there's a story, Lynette
Yes.
talks about, when I was 40, I decided to do IVF with the donor. No one told me how unlikely a pregnancy was if you're over 40. Only after I read a study that I realized that the success rates were pregnancies, not live births. My 2 miscarriages counted as successes in these eyes. She said, I had no idea that being a childless woman feels so different to me than being a childless man seems to feel to the guys. There's a difference there.
There's a huge difference. There's so much packed into Lynette's story. In a way, Lynette is my story, because I postponed childbearing for so long, and I thought it was going to be no big deal, and I had been lied to, and we didn't really have to have, there wasn't really going to be a decline in fertility, there wasn't really a problem, blah, blah, blah. And I was lucky that I was able to have children, but in my mind and my heart, I always wanted more children. And the idea that women don't have as many children as they want, that is something that the sexual revolutionaries will never tell you. That's a number they won't gather. That's data they won't report. Now, there are demographers who know that number, and in fact, most women do not have as many children as they ultimately want, But that's like, we're supposed to be okay with that. That pain, that grief, that sense of loss that women experience from postponing their fertility so long that it's impaired. Never mind. Never mind.
And
We
that
just
way,
won't even
many
talk about
times
it.
we have a social construct which says having a lot of kids isn't a good idea.
Right.
That being a mother isn't really going to be fulfilling, let alone very helpful to society in general.
Right.
So there's no support system. People live separate from extended families in many
Right.
cases. So it's more difficult to have that support. And the price of housing and things like that, which went up through the roof, makes it almost imperative that if one's looking to have a house, in many cases, you need 2 incomes.
But I didn't talk about that particular point in this book, but one can easily see that the whole society has built itself around contraception and abortion.
Right.
The 2-earner household is normal for the managerial class, so the kind of housing that college-educated professionals want, the price of that has gone up because they have the disposable income.
Right.
I mean, this is something.
It's actually a vicious cycle.
It's a cycle. It's a
the
cycle.
more people made, the higher the prices went.
That's right.
Which meant you
That's
needed
right.
to have more jobs to be able to pay the higher price.
That's exactly right. And if the expectation is that in order to succeed in the professions, you must postpone childbearing.
Right.
And so the professions are dominated by people who postpone childbearing,
Right.
which means people who use contraception probably abortion in the background. And that's why the newscasters and the lawyers and the judges and all these people are so committed.
Have the perspectives they have.
That's right.
Right, exactly.
That's
Many
right.
of them should just say, well, what about you?
How many abortions have you had?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you know what
right.
I mean? So at least we understand the context
Right.
you're coming from. Perhaps the most obvious cause of loneliness, talking about all these different things, St. Teresa said, talks about the lack of permanence in relationships. So
Right.
why do we see with all of this, why such a lack of permanence as a result of
Well,
this?
you know, the idea of the sexual revolution has been that that you can switch out your sexual partners, and there's no cost to you, there's no cost to anybody from doing that. So in order to defend that idea, you have to kind of downplay the idea that loyalty matters to people. You have to downplay the idea of fidelity as a virtue, right? Which, when you think about it, that's really weird. I mean, you can't think of any society that says we're going to incentivize unfaithfulness, but we do.
Right.
You know, our divorce courts incentivize unfaithfulness. It's completely crazy. So that's how we got ourselves into that mindset that this is okay.
No fault divorce coming out of California in the
Terrible.
60s, right?
It's terrible,
Okay.
you know, and the Ruth Institute has pioneered work in that area. I mean, you know, we actually will talk about it. Most pro-family organizations won't even touch divorce. They're scared of it because half of their board members are on their third wife or whatever, you know.
Right.
I mean, it's
No,
a huge problem.
Right.
If you look at things from the perspective of the child, and you ask what is owed to children, well, the answer that you would come up with is that children are entitled to a relationship with both parents. They're certainly entitled to know the identity of their parents, which means donor conception is completely off the table, falsified birth certificates completely off the table.
Well, isn't it interesting in some ways? Today there was this big movement about adopted children finding their birth parent.
Yeah.
As if that was so important.
Yeah.
And yet supposedly who gives birth to you doesn't really impact.
Yeah. What
Anybody
are
can
they
raise
talking
you.
about? Yeah,
So how do those things go together?
They don't.
Okay.
They don't. Okay,
Right.
so do not expect coherence from the secular world. Okay, forget about it. The sexual revolutionaries are it is an intellectual house of cards. And one of the mistakes that we have made as a church and a social conservative political movement and so on, we have the idea that is all we have to do is point out that it's crazy,
Right.
point out that it's mistaken, point out that it's incorrect, and everything will be solved. Well, no, that's not true, Doug, because the important point from the revolutionary point of view, the point is power, all right? And so if you are trying to create a society that cannot be, you need a lot of power to get that done. You need a lot of power to convince everybody that they don't really need their parents. You know, come on, that's the most basic human relationship that there is, you know, and yet that's what they're doing. Now, but go to the gender ideology. Right now, this is the most obvious example. The most obvious example.
Right.
And that is, if you can make people say Bruce Jenner is a woman, you can make them say anything. And I say the point of transgenderism is that.
Right.
It's not to make Bruce feel better.
The Nazis made Germans say that Jews weren't really people.
Yeah, it's the same sort.
So
it's the same sort of forced speech and forced thought and getting into your head, you know, kind of a thing. It's the ultimate in
You
power.
say that gender ideology goes far beyond the reasonable demand that men and women be treated with dignity and respect, and insists that differences between men and women are evidence of injustice. All such differences are suspect, at least, and quite possibly worse. And obviously, it's interesting, we're seeing kind of a little bit of a backlash now in women's sports,
Yes.
which anybody who was paying attention could have predicted was going to happen.
Right, right. Yeah, the women in sports is very interesting because back in the day, it's Title IX of the Civil Rights Act that has been twisted, okay? So when Obama said everybody, all public schools in the United States have to treat children according to their chosen gender, he was using Title IX of the Civil Rights Act to do that. And so that legal provision is the basis of a lot of this stuff. Well, back in the day, Title IX was used as a way of creating equality between boys and girls sports.
Right, so that they got funding for women's sports at
Oh,
college
more
and
than
things
that.
like
they
that.
went around shutting down men's
Well,
wrestling
they had
programs.
to. They did so that they could take
could
that
be
money
equal,
in.
so they
make it
could be
equal, right.
equal, right?
Right,
So you
right.
have the equal number of boys as girls participating in sports. Now, of course, anybody with a nickel's worth of sense knows that boys need their sports in a way that girls don't need their sports, want it, are interested in it. You know, all these most basic differences were in play. But the point of that was not to get girls involved in sports. The point of that was to go around flexing your federal muscles and shutting down men's wrestling programs. That was the point, was power. So now, when you've got the thing has come full circle, so that a man can enter a girls' track meet and, of course, win the state track meet, you know, and win the women's wrestling and women's weightlifting. You know, guys, I'm a woman, can go and win all those things.
Broke a bunch of records recently, right?
One
day.
Is amazing.
Just
Isn't that amazing? You know, and the federal government is standing behind that. Okay, so that, of course, that's the end of women in sports. There's a complete end of women actually participating in sports in any competitive manner because they can't compete against guys, right? So the point was never to get girls involved in sports. The point was always to empower the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy doesn't care whether it's coherent.
Right.
We know that.
And once the mob or the bureaucracy has power, it has to use it.
It morphs.
Right.
It morphs.
And it wants more.
It takes over more and more. More and more territory.
Right, and it wants to demonstrate more and more that it's in control.
And so, you know, if there was one takeaway that I want people to get from this book, it's this. The sexual revolution is a power grab. It's a sustained power grab, and it is not a force of nature that just, you know, like a hurricane blowing in off the Gulf or something, and that there's no human agency involved in it, we can't control it. You know, it just happened. It's just the march of history. That is not what the sexual revolution is all about. Sexual revolution is a power grab. That's what people need to know.
Well, I thought it was interesting you have these different stories in the beginning, and one of the things that struck me was you keep talking about these people in situations. The bottom line, so-and-so is free. The parents are free. This one's free. And then you make the point here that adults do not have particularly serious rights or responsibilities towards their children. And a lot of that seems to be the baby boomer generation, my generation, which seems very happy to think the 60s are still happening.
Right, right. Well, their kids are not as happy about it, right?
Which is why, as you point out, they're not so happy to call themselves feminists either, right?
That's right. That's right. That word, I spend a little time on the word feminist in this book because it is such a contested word. And I tend not to use the word unless I have a lot of explanation around it, because I've noticed that if I say feminist, people have all kinds of associations with it, and I am not necessarily talking about what they're talking about. So it's worthwhile to unpack that word a little bit, and I do spend there are a couple of sections in the book where I talk about that subject.
You talk about various narratives. You kind of alluded to the capitalist narrative of kind of the contraceptive mentality. What's the Catholic narrative?
Well, the Catholic narrative is that the human person is meant for love, and that we have rights and responsibilities towards one another, and that we should have sex with the person we're married to and no one else. We should get married and stay married unless somebody does something really awful. And oh, by the way, we should not be nagging and fussing and complaining at our spouses all the time. We have an obligation to try to love our spouses for the stability of the family and for the good of the whole family. You know, that love is the core of the thing. And so the Catholic, I would say that the Catholic position is internally consistent, internally coherent, in a way that the modern sexual revolutionary ideologies are simply not coherent.
Which is why they rail against it and try to pull it down.
Exactly,
And why it's such the enemy to be attacked.
That's right.
I thought this was interesting. You alluded to it before, our cultural blindness to the victims. The evidence of a major cultural contradiction may be right in front of us, but we don't allow ourselves to see it. And that's the situation. You list a whole bunch of things that have happened. Harvey Weinstein, all these things. We see the outcomes of these things, but somehow we never put it together.
Right. Yes. When I wrote this book, this book took shape over a period of a number of years. But right around the time that it was in final edits and was about to hit the press and then be frozen into time, Harvey Weinstein was coming out. The whole Me Too issue was coming out, and there were revelations in one field after another of sexual abuse and harassment, often not criminal, but certainly wrong, right? So it's not like it was children. It was adult women, often, sometimes adult men, but usually it was adult women being sexually harassed or abused. And what I noticed in that process, Doug, is that the secular people trying to deal with that can't really quite deal with it. they get that there's something wrong with what happened, but they're kind of hanging on to the idea of sexual liberation. They're hanging on to being what they call sex positive. And they want to hang on to their pills and their pornography and all of those other things. They certainly don't want to, go jump all the way over to this crazy Catholic thing,
Right.
But in fact, ladies marching on Washington wearing pink hats are not going to get to the bottom of what was wrong with Harvey Weinstein,
Right.
And then when the whole business broke with the church and the clerical sexual abuse, I realized, we at the Ruth Institute, we who have this full truth, we need to be speaking out
Right.
about the whole shooting match because nobody else will do it.
Right. One thing I wanted to get to, just as we're just about out of time, in the section on creating the contraceptive ideology, you talk about Griswold. All we
Yes.
want to do is allow married couples to contracept, serious health problems always. All we want to do is allow poor people the same contraceptive options as rich women. Then you make the point, which I think is great, later activists adapted those same formulas, right? And we hear that about divorce, abortion, sex education, underage abortion. It's interesting how
Yes.
that
Yes.
whole
So what
game plan is then used
yes,
by each succeeding group.
What I would say about this book is that in one sense of the word, if you just look at the specific issues, this poor book was out of date the minute it hit the press because more crazy things keep happening. But that structure that you just named, that structure is going to be there and help people no matter what the new issue might be that comes up. And that's part of it, to identify the propaganda, to identify the rhetorical strategies,
Very much like the civil rights movement. Civil rights for black Americans goes to feminists, goes to gay situation, then goes to transgender
And they keep adapting that same line of...
as intersectionality continues to plague us. Thank you so much, Jennifer Rohrbach-Morse, for spending the time to bring issues like this to our forefront. We see them happening, we just don't understand all the time what's going on behind the scenes. This will help. The Sexual State, How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along. That part is absolutely true. Published by TAN, available through EWTN's religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. Join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks.